Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the master bather, Scott Bradfield. We had master bathing all through the coronavirus, and we're going to masturbate straight through the next pandemic. We're kind of return. We're trying to slowly let all the water out of the quarantine bathtub. I mean, we've kind of been covering, because we've been at home and we've had so many different books and so many things to think about. We've been just kind of throwing tons of names at everybody and just making lots of lists and checking them too many times. And I'm going to try to slowly go back to kind of a little more focused pieces, just because I can't keep up with myself. But just to close off, we did, I think, 4 different top 10 lists of great short story collections. And literally 10 seconds after I posted it, someone said, "What about Borges?" Yeah, I know. Jesus Christ. I mean, of course, we should have Borges. This is the collected fictions. I'm always saying this is a hard book to read. I like Borges a lot. But, when you read his collected fiction, each one of his stories, when you read a great short story writer, a 4-page story takes a lot out of you, and it kind of reverberates for a long time after you read it. That's why I keep recommending reading the short single author collections. So you could get the collected fictions, which I like to have, but I don't like to read as much as I do the individual various editions. And I've always been a little partial to this old 60s or 70s era kind of retrospective of Borges' stories called the Aleph, mainly because the Aleph is one of my favorite Borges stories. I'll just give you I don't normally tell you the premise, but it's about a point in space that this guy finds in his basement. And when you look into that point in space, you see all space and time. Anyway, it's a love story. It's about 10-page story. It's a wonderful story called the Aleph. Okay, so now we're going to kind of slowly segue into our normal various theme episodes, and the one I've been wanting to do for quite a while is it's slightly we don't like to be too negative at the bathtub, but every once in a while I have to rant about some writer I do hate, and one of the writers I always hated in the 60s was Norman Mailer. I can't stand Norman Mailer. Please enjoy Norman Mailer at your leisure. I hate all of his books. With the possible exception of the Executioner's Song, which had a sort of an interesting reportage on the Gary Gilmore story. I've never been able to finish a Norman Mailer book. I think he couldn't write. I think his nonfiction was awful. I thought, when he would write this stuff about the Vietnam War, he never even told the story about the Vietnam War. It was always about him. So anyway, I've tried to read Norman Mailer for years. I have friends who think he's this great American writer. I don't think he could even write. He was just a big self-promoter. So anyway, he was a writer who was always sort of talked about as a political writer of the 60s and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to read him ever again, and I don't even have a copy of one of his books in my house. That's how much I dislike Norman Mailer. I have people in here I can't stand, and I got Saul Bellow, and I hate Saul Bellow, but I'll even have a couple Saul Bellow books. I can't stand Norman Mailer. The writer I kind of compare him to in this episode is Robert Stone, who is the opposite of Mailer in every way. He wrote incredibly well. He was a very much less far from a flamboyant personality, far from a self-promoting personality. I interviewed him once. He was a very restrained, kind of quiet, dense, almost impenetrable personality, and didn't look good on TV. He was big, scraggly. He looked like Sterling Hayden at his wildest, and was a wonderful writer. So I didn't want to talk too much. I'm going to put a link to a piece I just did for the New Republic, but I really enjoyed the opportunity to write about Robert Stone, who I've been reading since the 60s and 70s, one of the first serious writers I read, and it was probably Dog Soldiers, which was kind of made into an interesting movie called Who'll Stop the Rain, and he was one of the first kind of literary writers who kind of wrote intelligent thrillers. And this is about sort of how the CIA operations in Vietnam were connected to drug deals and all these kind of wealthy social kids who were running around who were connected to all these terrible people. And this kind of horrible network that basically took over the world since Vietnam. And a few kind of adrift characters who get mixed up with them. And it's quite a violent, funny, hallucinogenic is a big word in Robert Stone book that kind of trails off near the end. And I would say this is true of almost all the Robert Stone books. I make an argument in my piece that he doesn't really believe that you can do anything in this world. He's pretty much an existential a dark existentialist. And so making his plots work is they're basically a series of accidents. People keep bumping into each other over this long period of time. And all I can say is if you read two chapters of the Robert Stone books and you don't see good writing, every sentence is sculpted. He's a really intelligent writer. He's a good narrative writer. His characters are odd and very offbeat, often funny, and he has a really dark political sense of America and its damage throughout the world. So almost all his books are like that. This is Vietnam. This is about Central America. This is a great book, A Flag for Sunrise, and there's often he's very similar to Graham Greene. I keep thinking about him in the terms of Graham Greene and Brian Moore, both writers who wrote a lot of political novels, which were concerned with the way Catholicism was involved in political events. And Stone was a kind of lapsed Catholic, someone who would start off as a young boy in Catholic schools, and obviously didn't think much of it later. And so there's a Catholic priest in the middle of this. It's a beautiful piece of writing, so I really recommend A Flag for Sunrise. One of his less successful books, most people agree, Children of the Light, is based on his Hollywood experiences, but there's still some great, every sentence is beautifully written. There's a really good writing in it. Again, the plots tend to be kind of lost people, and then lots of their intelligent reflections on the world, and they tend to drift off. In most of these books, the endings are not my favorite parts of a Robert Stone novel. The first Robert Stone novel, Hall of Mirrors, the three of his books have just come out in the Library of America series. I always prefer, as I've told you over and over, to get the old mass market paperbacks. This was also published as WUSA, W-U-S-A. And reading Hall of Mirrors again in the past 6 months, in our age of Trump and the way the media is basically turned into these old 60s radio stations. When I was a kid, they were considered the aberrant parts of the media. You know, these crazy radio and television shows are always on. Joe Pine and all these guys who were just kind of, right-wing nutters, conspiracy theorists. And they would always, everybody who was slightly liberal. Teddy Kennedy was responsible for everything, the My Lai massacre and everything that had ever happened. This kind of craziness that's generated by this media machine. This is set in the 60s about this station called WUSA, which produces this type of radio. And you read it now, and it's basically reading the seeds of the present. And it's still dark, it's still very funny, and it's basically a giant Trump rally. When you read through it, it's about using these big stadiums to promote anger and rage and mythologies of America. And it's a comic novel that still holds up. At one point, someone says they're having this big arena meeting of all these crazy groups, and one of the characters says something like, "The only beast in the arena is the crowd." That's the Trump rally, isn't it? Okay, so all of those are worth reading. My favorite of all his books is Out of Bridge Reach. It's because it's a lot smaller focused. It's about a man going out to the ocean. It has to do with certain financial meltdowns at the end of the 90s and so forth, and a man who's kind of cast adrift by his financial life. And he goes off in this kind of yacht race. It's based on a real event, but very loosely. And it's so focused on this one man who basically loses his mind in the course of the book, with some frame of the wife back at home, that it's far and away the most satisfying, to my mind, of all of Robert Stone novels. So if I recommended one, I'd recommend Out of Bridge Reach, and I would also say that it's one of the most beautifully written novels of the past century, easily. One of the great pieces of writing. Norman Mailer never wrote a sentence as good as any of the sentences in this book. I've talked about all of this because, as I'll put the link on, there's a new biography. Madison Smart Bell, a very good novelist in his own way, has written a biography called Child of Light. A very, very worthwhile book if you like Robert Stone as much as I do. It's also interesting to me because, like the Hjortsberg book about Brautigan we talked about a while back and we'll talk about again, it's one of the few times I've read kind of a biography of someone which is written by a friend. I mean, normally I would not want to read a person writing a biography of a friend. But I think Vale does a very good job of maintaining that distance, and then being open about his own relationship with Stone, and still being objective about Stone. I think he does a really good job in that respect, which I think is hard to do. And it does a good job of showing the importance of Stone and why he's still an important writer to us today. He's a wonderful, wonderful prose writer. So I really recommend him. I would try Out of Bridge Reach, and my second best, probably A Flag for Sunrise. Has some horrific. He does a lot of psychopaths, by the way. Psychopathic killers, most of whom seem to work for the American government. I would recommend those two, but Dog Soldiers is good too. Okay, happy bathing. This is I've got the Rosemary Baby eye still going, so I've got the sunglasses going. We got the natural light going, and we're going to try to pretend we're at the beach, even though we're not. We're just sitting in the bathtub reading books. Have a great week. Stay safe with great books.